Welcome to another boring topic. Today we will be finishing the story of OS/2, starting from the 1990 release of the final OS/2 version that Microsoft and IBM developed under the 1985 Joint Development Agreement. Following this, Microsoft and IBM acrimoniously split, and IBM took over sole development of OS/2. IBM's then continued attempts to crush its erstwhile partner and drive Windows from the marketplace, or at least make OS/2 a viable competing standard to Windows, was, in the end, an effort doomed to failure. This wasn't due to any superiority that Windows had over OS/2 in features, but rather IBM's stubborn refusal to do anything intelligent to get OS/2 into the hands of consumers, and indeed IBM's almost Commodore-like ability to shoot itself painfully in the foot as frequently as possible. I say almost Commodore-like because IBM is still around today, and Commodore, well, I'm sure they're having fun romping around a meadow with IMSI, MITs, and maybe digital research. Whereas Microsoft did almost everything right when it came to getting widespread Windows adoption, IBM did almost everything wrong when it came to trying to do the same thing for OS/2. But before the end came, OS/2 somehow soldiered on, getting progressively more mature and feature-rich, and inspiring a following that was arguably even more devoted than Apple's acolytes, as Scott Adams referenced in a 1995 Dilbert comic strip. It has been said that while success has many fathers, failure has only one. Yet OS/2's failure required a host of fathers, apparently assiduously working towards a single goal: preventing OS/2 from ever truly competing with Windows. One might almost suspect that Microsoft had infiltrated a legion of nerdy James Bonds into IBM's upper management with a mission of ensuring the complete domination of Windows. Sadly, there were no secret agents involved, just a long succession of incompetence from both individuals, as well as IBM's increasing corporate dysfunction and absolutely mind-bogglingly complex bureaucracy. To illustrate this last point, I will simply point out that in 1988, an IBM vice president, one of the top 50 positions in the entire company, was still a whopping 7 layers away from the chief executive, so far as IBM's reporting structure went. That sort of corporate structure isn't exactly a recipe for a fast-moving company, but it absolutely is a recipe for enormous amounts of corporate paralysis, fighting, and dysfunction. There is something that I want to say, though, before we really start diving into things. I'm about to be pretty hard on IBM as a company, and I'm about to be pretty hard on a couple of IBM's leaders. However, I want to be very, very clear that I do not think a single person or division at IBM deliberately and/or maliciously sabotaged OS/2's chance of being successful in any way. Of the multitude of poor decisions that eventually wound up destroying OS/2, some were immediately evident as a bad choice, some were very quickly evident as a bad choice, and some were a bad choice simply due to bad luck for IBM mixed with good luck for Microsoft. But so far as I can tell, none of these choices were made with a deliberate goal of destroying OS/2. The fact of the matter is that IBM was a massive organization that was rife with infighting and red tape, and there were any number of good leaders in it who attempted to succeed in spite of the dysfunction, sometimes while also attempting to reduce the dysfunction and red tape themselves. That's a hard battle to fight, and even the best of leaders can fail to correctly juggle those two burdens. A certain Dilbert series about battling business units is very, very applicable here, as IBM's various divisions and power blocks squabbled and fought for their internal goals and successes, with IBM's success as a whole being a frequent victim, and no victim was more injured more often than OS/2. To help balance out the story, I'm going to, as I can, single out a couple people who attempted to recover, repair, or at least mitigate the effects of the poor decision-making. One was an IBM leader who brought a level of energy, hard work, and experience to his role that, in a more fair world, would have been rewarded with more success. The other man was outside of IBM, but was passionately devoted to OS/2 and did everything he could to promote it while also calling out its weaknesses in an attempt to rectify them. In a more fair world, his passion would have been better rewarded as well. I hope that by doing this, I can balance out the criticism I am about to levy with at least a hint of positivity. IBM genuinely had a lot of creative, hard-working, genuinely interesting people within the company, and I am doing my best to avoid making a joke about none of them apparently being in the marketing department. And the OS/2 community as a whole had a lot of passionate supporters in it, who took OS/2's ups and downs very personally. On an unrelated note, While I'm not aware of any sources that state this, I have to at least point out that IBM's naming scheme for OS/2 was really odd, and seemed to have little rhyme or reason. As an example, OS/2 1.3 was sold in competition with Windows 3.0, and OS/2 2.0 and OS/2 2.1 competed against Windows 3.1. If consumers know nothing about two software products, there is a tendency to pick the one with a higher, or at least less confusing number. Although again, I have never seen a source cite this as one of OS/2's problems. However, I guarantee OS/2's odd versioning didn't help position it in the marketplace at all. In December 1990, OS/2 1.3 was released. This version was the final one to be developed under the joint development agreement between Microsoft and IBM. OS/2 1.3 was far more usable than previous OS/2 versions, as it not only had a fairly high chance of actually printing correctly on the printers most people owned, but it also had a reasonably nice suite of applications available from IBM's desktop software division. And here we see IBM's incredible ability to shoot itself in the foot strongly manifest itself. We've seen it before with how IBM lost control of the PC market hardware standard. Now it's time for this tendency to start attacking whatever control IBM still had over the software standard. And the desktop software division was about to be the first major victim of the 1990s. Based out of Milford, Connecticut, this division had been formed in 1988 when IBM had the rather surprisingly bright idea of forming a new division of people brought in from outside the polished suits and ties world of Big Blue. The division's goal was to focus on developing more applications for OS/2. Being from outside the mainframe-dominated world of Big Blue, they could bring in fresh ideas and perspectives, and hopefully help give IBM the knowledge it needed to successfully compete in the application marketplace. The desktop software division threw itself into the work with enthusiasm, and by the time OS/2 1.3 was ready for release in 1990, their hard work had produced a suite of products that enabled a new OS/2 user to do word processing, give business presentations, and even do desktop publishing. And these products were all reasonably polished, solid experiences. For some arcane reason I have not been able to figure out, these applications were also going to be released for Windows. However, the Windows versions were at least scheduled to ship well after the OS/2 versions, with the exclusivity hopefully giving OS/2 a boost right out of the gate. However, the desktop software division had not solely been tunnel-focused on developing OS/2 applications. They had also been paying close attention to the marketplace and the rising Windows tide. Realizing that OS/2 needed some time to build momentum, and also recognizing that the PC world was eagerly seeking a modern GUI, they were concerned that Windows would steamroll right over OS/2 before it had a chance to build market share and meet the market's desires. With this in mind, they managed to get a meeting set up with the president of IBM himself, John Akers. In the meeting, the desktop software division representatives begged Akers to take the rather unusual step of buying a GUI from a small software company called GeoWorks, whose flagship product carried the same name. Unlike the legendarily sluggish Windows, GeoWorks apparently ran quite well even on the slow 8086 processor of the original IBM PC from 1981. This wasn't the only option on IBM's table either. They could also choose to throw Gary Kildall a bone and use Gem running on top of DR-DOS, cutting Microsoft and MS-DOS out of the picture. DR-DOS was an excellent operating system that, for all intents and purposes, was fully compatible with the existing body of PC software, and Gem was an excellent GUI that ran on top of DOS, whether DR-DOS or MS-DOS. While Gem itself would eventually power the Atari ST, sadly, a pairing with IBM would never happen, of course. One final option that, according to Merrill Chapman's book, was widely discussed inside of IBM was to use the Presentation Manager interface and then apparently slather it on top of DOS. Now, I cannot seem to find any details about how this would have worked, so I'm somewhat guessing here. But the only way this would seem to make sense would be if Presentation Manager was a program that ran on top of DOS, similar to how Windows functioned. Presumably the eventual goal would have been to quietly migrate people over to OS/2, which would have looked the same to the average user, but had the modern OS/2 foundation instead of the aging DOS one. It seems like this wouldn't have been a bad idea, but I'm curious what you all think about it. Let me know in the comments if you think this idea would have worked out better than what IBM actually did. Even as the 1980s came to a close, IBM still had the upper hand with Microsoft and could even go so far as to threaten them with the termination of the joint development agreement and just go their own way if they didn't halt all Windows development. At this point, which was prior to the release of Windows 3.0 and the first significant success Microsoft would see with Windows, there was at least a good chance that Microsoft would have backed down, potentially allowing IBM to strangle Windows before it had a chance to firmly cement itself as the dominant GUI for PCs. But it was not to be. When the desktop software division representatives met with Akers, they were treated politely but condescendingly. In Search of Stupidity quotes Akers as calling them a group of good kids before lecturing them on the realities of life as IBM saw it. Essentially, IBM controlled the PC market, controlled the standards, and presumably thanks to OS2 and PS2 it always would. Akers referred to Gates as a nice boy, who presumably was too innocent and naive to ever pose a threat to IBM. Akers also confidently asserted that IBM had
a cunning plan to solve the problem
of positioning OS2 versus Windows. This plan would soon be realized in a Python-esque agreement with Microsoft in which Windows was supposed to be positioned solely for low-end machines, whereas OS2 was reserved for the rarefied heights of high-end machines. Or, in other words, Windows was for the computers most people owned, and OS2 was reserved for the computers they wished they could afford. Meanwhile, back at the meeting with Akers, the desktop software reps were given a pat on the head and a lollipop before being sent back to their cubicles. The entire desktop software division was then disbanded in 1992, right before the release of OS2 2.0. This ensured that future releases of OS2 were robbed of the applications that they would otherwise have ensured were available, something that would almost immediately hit hard with the next major release, OS2 2.0. And as Windows accelerated into an unbeatable titan, proving that the concerns raised had been 100% valid, it was probably at least mild consolation to the former desktop software members that Akers was booted out of IBM shortly after disbanding them. I promised that we would try to balance out the criticisms by spotlighting a couple of interesting people, so I think this is a good place to introduce Jim Cannavino, the new head of IBM's PC division as of the end of 1988. Cannavino, although comparatively young, was a longtime IBM veteran and was considered a potential candidate for IBM chairman. A hard-working, hard-driving man, Cannavino had previously headed IBM's mainframe division, responsible for half of IBM's total revenue and a whopping 2/3 of its profits. And he did it all by age 40. Cannavino's story is an interesting one, as he was far from the typical IBM employee, having talked his way into a job interview when he was only a teenager. And when I say that Cannavino was hardworking, if anything, that's an understatement. He married as soon as he graduated from high school, supporting his young and growing family by working 3 separate jobs at the same supermarket: produce manager, meat manager, and a third managerial position. The 3 salaries kept him working from 6 in the morning until 10 at night, but it did let him earn a reasonable living for his family. Just for extra fun, on top of all this work, he also started taking electronics classes at the DeVry Technical Institute near Chicago. Eventually, while still a teenager, Cannavino found his way to an IBM branch office in Oak Park and managed to bluff his way into an unscheduled job interview with the branch manager, a Mr. Thompson. Cannavino convinced Thompson to give him the aptitude test for IBM's repair technicians and aced it. But since he only had a high school degree, he didn't really meet IBM's standards for hiring technicians. But since it was the early 1960s and IBM was in the middle of a rapid expansion due to its $5 billion gamble on the new S360 line of mainframes, Thompson took a chance and hired Cannavino, who, again, was still a teenager at the time. I believe he was 19 years old. As Thompson was considering his decision, Cannavino promised him that he would be Thompson's best repair technician within 6 months of being hired, or else he would give back all of his paychecks. Thompson thought Cannavino was joking, but he eventually found out that he was dead serious. How did he find out? A few months later, when IBM's payroll division reached out to him to find out why Cannavino was throwing off their books by never cashing his checks. Cannavino explained to the first incredulous, then amused Thompson that he had been keeping all of his payroll checks in a shoebox, just in case he had to return them. Since this obviously meant that he had no income from IBM, he'd taken a job at a pizza parlor on the side to pay the bills. From that point on, Cannavino's rise through IBM had been meteoric, as he soon moved from repair work into mainframe programming, quickly gaining a reputation as one of IBM's best bug fixers. Before too much longer, he was moved to New York, the center for all of IBM's mainframe programming at the time. Cannavino soon figured out a way to make a lot of existing applications run much faster on the new S360 systems, and when nobody believed him, he basically stole a mainframe to prove it. Okay, he didn't technically steal it. What he did was first find an IBM division that was scheduled to have a mainframe delivered to it that he felt wouldn't miss it for a few months. Then he sneaked into the mainframe shipping area and changed the shipping label on the division's shiny new mainframe, having it sent to a vacant IBM lab instead. He then spent the next several months working with a couple other programmers to prove his theory, and was able to make improvements that led to speed increases of over double for many applications. This and other successes, plus Cannavino's incredible appetite for work, rocketed him up to first the head of IBM's mainframes, and then to take over the PC division after Bill Lowe decided to leave for a position at Xerox in 1988. And after spending 6 months working on fixing some of the most pressing process issues in the division, Cannavino turned his formidable attention to Microsoft and what exactly IBM was getting out of its business relationship and the JDA, and he was not happy with what he found. OS2 wasn't selling well at all. It had a lot of bug reports stacked up, and Cannavino was not happy with what he felt was the undisciplined way Microsoft wrote code. Remember, Cannavino was not just a mainframe programmer. He was the product of a programming culture that emphasized methodical, well-organized, well-commented, and painstakingly documented code. This was, not exactly the way Microsoft worked. And the clash between Cannavino's methodical mainframe programming background and expectations and the more freewheeling maverick style that Microsoft's programmers tended to use, well, it was bound to cause immediate friction. Additionally, a lot of key parts of OS2 had been written by Microsoft, not IBM, and according to Big Blues, The Unmaking of IBM, if IBM ever tried to make a clean break, it would find that it had to start pretty much from scratch on parts of the code that were not only important, but were so complicated that it might take IBM programmers a couple of years to get up to speed. A frightfully long time in the PC business. Cannavino also had to deal with the fact that IBM's accounting procedures treated software development in a way that basically handcuffed him to OS2, no matter his concerns. Essentially, IBM only counted a quarter of the yearly cost for developing a piece of software, with the remaining 3/4 spread over the following years. By 1989, IBM had been spending about $150 million a year on OS2 development, and had rolled forward the bulk of that over a number of years, totaling at least $225 million of deferred costs hanging over Cannavino's head. If he decided to back out of OS2 entirely, which was unthinkable anyhow based on the amount of public promises IBM had made to the businesses that had already invested in OS2. But if he decided to do it anyhow, along with all the other problems, almost $250 million of deferred expenses would come crashing down onto his head. It was unthinkable. And so Cannavino decided he had no choice but to continue with OS2 and with Microsoft as a partner, at least until he could figure out what to do to break the deadlock. Throughout 1989 and 1990, Cannavino worked at this problem, while he also did his best to court some major software makers like Lotus, Software Publishing, and Metaphor to invest into applications for OS2, while also promising them that he would bring Gates to heel and ensure that Windows would not take over the market. And he had a series of intense meetings with Gates, starting in summer of 1989, trying to hammer out a compromise that would solve his problems or at least reduce them. But it was all for naught. In spite of Cannavino's best efforts to figure out a solution that would enable him to crush the threat Windows represented and position OS2 for success. In the end, Microsoft and IBM went their separate ways in 1990, and IBM had to take over full responsibility for OS2's continued development and marketing, for better or worse. But this actually almost didn't happen, according to one source. According to the book Big Blues, The Unmaking of IBM, in early 1991, Cannavino was actually seriously considering just throwing in the towel on OS2, admitting Gates and Windows had won, and saving the $125 million a year that he was spending on an operating system that very few people seemed interested in, even with all the problems that this would cause. And the then chairman of IBM, John Akers, was apparently thinking the same thing. In a meeting with Akers and other IBM senior management in early 1991, Akers basically asked why IBM should continue to invest in OS2 when it seemed the market just wanted Windows. Cannavino responded by admitting that maybe IBM should just give up on OS2, however, he thought that there was a 60% chance that it was worth continuing. According to Big Blues, Cannavino said that he thought that IBM should continue with OS2 partly because it could make real money in personal computer operating systems, even though the market was a relatively small $600 million a year, and IBM, through OS2, had almost no market share. Cannavino also raised the whole issue of setting standards. If Microsoft controlled the market, then it, not IBM, would decide when to build capabilities into the operating system that would let software developers build video, for example, into their applications. Cannavino clearly had a pretty good idea of what was at stake, and he succeeded in persuading Akers to continue OS2 development. OS2 would survive another day, and in spite of his reservations, Cannavino was determined to do whatever he could to make it a success. One additional rather entertaining nugget that I found lies in OS2 reported sales numbers. Specifically, it's claimed by early 1991 that around 600,000 copies of OS/2 had been sold since its 1987 launch. IBM arrived at this figure by taking the 300,000 copies of OS/2 that were actually sold, and then adding another 300,000 copies of OS/2 that were given away to a number of IBM's largest accounts when they purchased sufficient amounts of IBM's memory boards. According to Big Blues, as far as anyone could tell, those 300,000 copies of OS/2 had never been used. The interesting part comes in when Bill Gates started publicly pointing out that only 300,000 copies had been sold, something he would know because Microsoft had only received royalties for 300,000 copies of OS/2. IBM quickly sent him a royalty check to cover the other 300,000 copies, provided Gates agreed to start publicly using the 600,000 sales figure instead, which Gates did while also telling multiple reporters exactly what had happened and then smilingly insisting that they use the 600,000 figure. In spite of the collapse of the JDA, IBM's developers got to work fairly quickly on getting the next version of OS/2 ready to go, all on their own, and after a mildly surprisingly short 2 years of development, OS/2 2.0 was released in April of 1992. Largely thanks to the previously mentioned disbandment of the desktop software division, it didn't exactly launch with a host of killer apps, or even one killer app. This failure was, again, entirely on IBM's shoulders, as OS/2 2.0 was the first release that IBM was solely responsible for marketing and selling, and they were badly struggling to figure out a coherent strategy. By this point, it was clear that OS/2 was badly trailing Windows in sales, which was racking up large numbers thanks largely to the success of Windows 3.0, and had sold around 30 million copies across all versions by this point. This number does not include the large number of pirated copies either, as contemporary versions of Windows were almost ludicrously easy to pirate, something that undoubtedly helped drive greater adoption. And to add insult to injury, guess what else was released in April of 1992?
But really, Microsoft Windows just makes your everyday work easier. Isn't that the point of personal computing anyway? Microsoft Windows.
Yep, you guessed it. On April 6, 1992, Microsoft released Windows 3.1. So OS/2 2.0 was launched directly into strong headwinds as the successor to the most popular Windows version to date, Godzilla, stomped onto the scene the exact same month. Even before its release, Windows 3.1 was already clearly going to be a massive success, and I doubt it's a coincidence that it was released just in time to stomp all over OS/2 2.0's launch. Gates always plays to win, and he always goes for the throat whenever possible. From a features perspective, OS/2 2.0 was a genuinely powerful release, with functionality and stability that were years ahead of Windows 3.1. It was a largely 32-bit operating system, capable of exploiting the full power of 486 and the new Pentium processors, whereas Windows 3.1 was still trapped by its 16-bit legacy. OS/2 2.0 had also embraced object-oriented programming, which was extremely forward-looking and also something that Steve Jobs' Next computer company had been pushing for years with their advanced Next Step operating system. I mostly bring this up to demonstrate that IBM was genuinely innovating and trying to push the state-of-the-art forward in bringing a modern, multitasking, 32-bit, object-oriented operating system to the broader consumer market. OS/2 2.0 also ditched the old Presentation Manager graphical interface that had been developed in partnership with Microsoft and contained many elements in common with Windows, in favor of a new and original graphical interface called Workplace Shell. OS/2 was moving firmly away from its confusing Windows-Microsoft heritage and was becoming a solidly IBM product. And honestly, this was a very good thing, and OS/2 2.0 really does a good job of showing that IBM had learned a thing or two over the previous years about how to develop good software. Unfortunately, everything apart from OS/2 development was still pretty much a die roll as to whether it was going to be a smart move or not. To help drive the broader OS/2 community, IBM had founded the IBM Independent Vendor League, or IVL. This organization was formed to help market OS/2 through books, magazines, certifications, and similar marketing strategies. In addition, there were also several forums set up, most prominently being Will Zachman's Canopus forum, which was hosted on CompuServe. IBM also made a smart decision in appointing David Barnes as OS/2's lead evangelist, a position that, according to his LinkedIn, he began in January of 1990. Barnes was probably the closest thing IBM had to Guy Kawasaki, Apple's chief evangelist for the Macintosh back in the 1980s. Barnes was an enthusiastic speaker who was not only passionate about OS2, but was personable and extremely good at communicating OS2's strengths and, well, evangelizing for the platform. He was also extremely good at taking complex features such as multi-threading and 16 versus 32 bits, breaking them down and explaining them in an easy-to-understand fashion. You can get a good feel for how good a speaker he was from the following clip, taken from a 1993 event where he presented OS2 2.1 versus a Microsoft rep who presented NT, and then a lively Q&A ensued.
Yes, we sell hardware as the IBM Corporation, but my objective is to get OS2 to run on as many machines as possible, and that's what we plan on doing. Other things that are in here that are new, PCM-CIA support for the PCM-CIA and the portable machines, as well as advanced power management, okay? Now, the biggest thing out of all of this is that now I can have my OS2 devices, and they can be non-IBM devices, and that's terrific. Oh, by the way, I'll let you know, I got a 48633 here. I've got 16 megabyte of memory, because I get it free, and I'll tell you that I could do this demo in 8 and you would be duly impressed. You really would. It is very impressive in 8. OS2's minimum, on the side of the box it says 4. David Barnes says 6 is the minimum. I like 8. It's a nice sweet spot and everybody's pretty happy at 8 megabyte. Okay? Now,
in his role as lead evangelist, Barnes traveled to 41 different countries, gave up to a dozen presentations a week, and even starred in a series of commercials for IBM called The Warped World of David Barnes. He was a huge asset to IBM and OS2, and appointing him to his position was something you can definitively say that IBM did right. IBM's setting up of the IVL and various related marketing efforts somewhat balanced out its decision to close down the desktop software division, but did not make up for losing the applications that would have otherwise launched with OS2 2.0 and helped it gain traction. IBM was helped out, however, by the fact that Microsoft and its legendarily cutthroat tactics was starting to loom large and menacing in the eyes of a number of software developers who were beginning to think that maybe IBM was the lesser of two evils. IBM also diverted a lot of wasted effort into an abortive partnership with a directionless Apple, with both companies working on a project called Taligent. Taligent was supposed to be a next-generation operating system, one that Apple badly needed, but seemed a bit of a head-scratcher for IBM to be involved in. This description actually doesn't do justice to just how odd Taligent was. As In Search of Stupidity puts it, Taligent started out as an attempt to build yet another next-generation OS, which then morphed into a half-witted effort to build an OS that would run other OSs. When this proved unfeasible, Taligent decided to waste more time and money creating a series of middleware tools that no one understood, or bought, before someone woke up and pulled the plug on the entire fiasco. Before it finally imploded, Taligent burned through about $500 million, although I am unsure if that was its total cost or just what IBM spent on it. Regardless, IBM definitely spent a lot of money and wasted a lot of effort that OS2 badly needed, spent on it instead. Thanks to Taligent and the Apple partnership, there were even rumors that Apple and IBM were going to merge and OS2 was going to replace its existing GUI with the Macintosh one. Fortunately for IBM, most OS2 developers seemed to ignore this rumor and kept their efforts focused on selling and developing their OS2 applications. Of course, IBM was busy making their job much harder than it needed to be, since IBM still refused to set up direct marketing efforts or distribution channel programs aimed at increasing the visibility of OS2 applications from third-party developers. As Chapman puts it, several attempts were made to convince the powers that were to create software promotional bundles with OS2, or at the very least include trialware versions of applications in retail units of the product. All such attempts foundered. Something like this could have not only helped to directly increase the sales of the third-party applications that OS2 desperately needed, but also encouraged third-party developers to keep working on OS2 applications instead of feeling like they were completely alone and without any support in selling their products. About all you could say about IBM's attitude toward its third-party OS2 developers was that it was basically benign neglect, not active hatred. I guess if you put IBM's behavior next to the hostility Atari had originally had towards any third-party developer that dared to develop games for the Atari 2600, IBM looks fairly good. But absent such a favorable comparison, IBM's behavior makes it quite hard to feel sorry for what eventually happened to them. And IBM's complete lack of intelligence in handling their third-party developers pales in comparison to the mind-numbingly foolish decision to incorporate Windows 3.0 into OS2 2.0 and Windows 3.1 into the following release, OS2 2.1. Keep in mind, at this point, Windows was rapidly gaining traction and market share, but was still very much in the minority when it came to its install base, not because of OS/2 or any other alternative operating system, but because most PCs still solely ran MS-DOS without any sort of graphical user operating system. And with that in mind, let's also talk about MS-DOS compatibility in OS/2 before tackling its Windows compatibility. After all, Windows might be shiny and finally selling really well, but MS-DOS applications were still a huge part of the market, and OS/2 had excellent MS-DOS compatibility, with the OS/2 2X line seriously beefing up what it could do. While the OS/2 1X line could only run a single DOS session in a single window at a time, the 2X line enabled the user to run multiple DOS sessions simultaneously, each in their own window and virtual machine.
And if I point and click at this, an existing DOS application, Lotus 123, now is really taking advantage of the object-oriented characteristics. I pointed.
There was no need for IBM to include a full version of Windows with OS/2. It served no useful long-term strategic purpose, and in fact would serve as a sort of Trojan horse that would contribute to OS/2's failure. However, thanks to the remnants of the agreement with Microsoft, IBM was free to include a full version of Windows with OS/2 where it ran inside of a virtual machine. And by free to do so, I mean that IBM had the right to do it, but also had to pay Microsoft for each copy of OS/2 sold. Byte magazine in 1994 stated that the license deal required IBM to pay $20 per copy of OS/2, something that contributed at least $50 million to Microsoft's war chest from OS/2 2.0 sales alone, and helped contribute to OS/2's high price of over $200. Although a $20 royalty fee definitely does not excuse charging OS/2's far higher price than Windows 3 and 3.1 did. But poor pricing for OS/2 is a bit of a recurring theme for Big Blue, and it's going to come up again. Another word on OS/2 2.0 and 2.1's Windows compatibility. While it was quite good, there were still issues that could arise due to memory management conflicts. Basically, Windows 3 and 3.1 have their own memory manager, as does OS/2. In order for the OS/2 2X series to run Windows 3 and 3.1, the two clashing memory management systems had to be forced to work together somehow. It seems that this was never fully satisfactorily worked out, as Byte magazine said in the January 1994 issue that, unable to modify the Windows code to use OS/2's memory management services directly, the OS/2 developers settled on using the Windows memory manager within the OS/2 memory manager. Windows manipulations of memory can spill over into the OS/2 swap file. A quick caveat on OS 2.0's Windows compatibility as well. While the vast majority of Windows and DOS applications did run without issue, it was unable to run any Windows applications that ran under enhanced mode. This represented a minority of applications, but did prevent OS/2 from being able to legitimately claim full Windows compatibility. IBM's marketing positioned OS/2 as able to run the vast majority of DOS and Windows applications, as well as its own native applications, of course. And Byte credited this compatibility with OS/2 2.0's sales numbers of at least 2.5 million, but Windows compatibility was a two-edged sword. The fact that Windows applications ran reasonably well under OS/2 created a significant positioning problem for OS/2. Because Windows was exploding in popularity while OS/2 was still struggling to gain traction, a number of developers who had committed to creating OS/2 applications instead targeted Windows, and then used the loophole of OS/2's Windows compatibility to claim that their applications were, in fact, OS/2 compatible. What IBM had done was basically take their enemy's Trojan horse, cheerfully invite it into their city, and then brag in their marketing about doing so. Sadly, IBM's marketing of OS/2 was consistently either wrong-headed, poorly implemented, or just baffling. No better example of this can be found than IBM's mind-numbingly pointless decision to sponsor the Austin, Texas-based college football Fiesta Bowl from 1993 to 1995. This sponsorship, which cost IBM millions of dollars, made absolutely no sense from the start. Who exactly were they reaching? As In Search of Stupidity puts it, it was unclear what benefit IBM derived from slapping the name OS/2 on a second-tier sporting event. No demographic information seemed to exist that indicated that people who watched the Fiesta Bowl were also highly interested in 32-bit OSs, and there wasn't much proof that watching a college football game would make people more inclined to rush home and demand computer resellers stock up on OS/2. Once the sponsorship went through, the event was renamed to the IBM OS/2 Fiesta Bowl, at which point IBM discovered that it was its prerogative, and more importantly its responsibility, to provide a lineup of third parties who would be advertising during a series of time slots that came with the sponsorship. This was news to IBM, who apparently had not read the fine print of the contract. Perhaps their lawyers were off sick that day. This could have been an opportunity for IBM to boost some of the best OS2 applications and third-party companies, specific applications and their features always being an easier way to grab a potential customer's attention as opposed to touting the benefits of the operating system they run under. I mean, it still wouldn't have redeemed the inherent stupidity of sponsoring the Fiesta Bowl in the first place, but it would have at least possessed the talking point of quasi-coherence as a making lemonade out of lemons marketing strategy. Additionally, May of 1993 would see the release of the amazingly creatively named OS2 2.1, which was a significant upgrade, more so than the slight version number increase would indicate. I'll let IBM spokesman John Soyring, who we will be meeting again later, give a quick summary of the changes between 2.0 and 2.1, especially the increased Windows compatibility and the friendlier, more approachable, object-oriented desktop.
Well, first of all, in OS2 2.1, we can run some additional applications that we were unable to run in OS2 2.0. OS2 2.0 was able to run most DOS applications and Windows applications, but there were a few Windows applications we couldn't run, and those were called enhanced mode Windows applications. There's a couple of them on this system right now that are installed, like Wolfram's Mathematica or the OmniPage Professional, which is a scanning application, which are enhanced mode applications which under OS2 2.1 now are able to run.
Okay.
In addition, DOS and Windows applications run much faster under this release of the operating system, and we integrate into the operating system multimedia features, which now will be standard on every
we'll get to
system
see that a
ship.
little bit later on.
Yes,
First of
we
all,
will.
just give us a little introduction to this OS2 desktop and some of the things you can do, John.
Okay, what many people so far have found very attractive is the ease of use, and many compare this to the Apple Macintosh, and some argue that it's easier to use than the Macintosh because of it builds into an object-oriented interface facilities such that a user can manipulate what are viewed to be everyday objects just by directly
Or show me what you mean
pointing to
on the
them
screen, John.
and dragging to them. So what we'll do is take a look.
Now, I am not buying his claim that OS2 was easier to use than the Mac OS, which, for all of its problems in 1993, remained the gold standard in approachability and ease of use. I'm sure my comments section will probably have some differing opinions on this as well, but this is my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. However, the features he brings up, especially the improved DOS and Windows compatibility, for all the fact that I think it was a mistake to include it, were definitely attention-grabbing, a stable, easy-to-use, powerful, multitasking operating system that could run all of your existing Windows and DOS applications and do it on your ordinary 386 or 486 consumer desktop, backed by the power and resources of IBM, well, that would seem to be a pretty good value proposition. An advertising campaign that played these facts up and then got people excited about a bunch of spiffy new OS2 applications would seem to be at least an effort in the right direction of building some hype. The broader consumer market at that point didn't really buy an operating system just to have it, so mentioning the new OS2 release and then quickly pivoting to some exciting new OS2 only applications to try to build some anticipation would have at least made some sense. And IBM, as previously mentioned, had a bunch of newly acquired ad space at the Fiesta Bowl. However, IBM of course made zero effort to make use of the ad space for OS2 applications. Rather than quickly calling up their best OS2 application developers, giving them the opportunity to do a quick commercial for their product, IBM instead desperately reached out to local Austin businesses to see if they wanted the time slots. Advertising from barbecue joints, garages, and car dealerships would of course contribute absolutely nothing to OS2 struggles, but such a thought apparently never occurred to IBM. The end result of this exercise in creative marketing was not successful by any metric known to man, and within IBM, the Fiesta Bowl became quietly known as the Fiasco Bowl. As previously mentioned, OS2 2.1 was a significant upgrade for OS2 users. As a matter of fact, it was awarded a Byte Award for Excellence in January of 1994 in Byte Magazine's annual roundup of the best products. In the article explaining the reasons for the award, Byte declared that the latest revamp of OS2 has solved most, if not all, of the problems plaguing the long-in-coming version 2.0, and then went on to laud OS2 as an operating system that is finally winning some of the vital support it needs, and as of this version, truly deserves, which was all definitely good news for OS2 and boded well for its sales. Furthermore, the article also contained a further quote from Byte's executive editor, John Udell, saying, "Running OS2 2.1 on an 8 megabyte machine that hasn't a prayer of running Windows NT, I find that it delivers many of the same benefits: robust multi-threading and multitasking, a comprehensive 32-bit API, an advanced file system, and competent support for Windows 3.1 software." Software developers have known for years that OS2 is a far more productive environment than DOS plus Windows. With the polish and maturity of version 2.1, more and more users are discovering the same advantage. This was a big win for OS2, especially being favorably compared feature-wise with the shiny new Windows NT, but with lower system specs. Lower required system specs from a Microsoft competitor is hardly new, of course, but the thought of that coming from IBM, the company that Microsoft programmers had long sneered at for being stodgy, not hiring the best people, and for having a focus on lines of code rather than efficiency, well, that was a bit of a surprise. But OS2 2.1 was proving that IBM's programmers had learned at least a thing or two about code optimization and tighter programming. And there was further good news from IBM's development efforts. With the November 1993 release of OS2 for Windows, the problem of paying Microsoft royalties for including Windows with every OS2 sale had been at least partially solved via updating OS2's Windows support to allow for a user who already owned Windows 3.1 to install OS2 on top of it, and OS2 would then use the user's pre-existing Windows install to drive its Windows compatibility. Hence, OS2 for Windows didn't need to include a copy of Windows in every box, and I guess the theory was that sales reps would point people in the direction of the correct OS2 2.1 version for their needs, whether with or without Windows. However, I did find an article complaining about the poor service OS2 received from sales reps, so I suspect this may have created a significant amount of confusion. IBM would get a mild amount of revenge the following decade when Microsoft decided that what people really wanted was to choose between approximately 42 versions of Vista, some of which sold better than others, of course. Additionally, from what I can tell, IBM still had to pay a royalty to Microsoft for every version of the normal OS2 2.1 sold, as that included Windows in it. It just didn't need to pay royalties for any copies of OS2 2.1 for Windows sold. The lack of a need to pay royalty fees meant that OS2 for Windows actually only cost half of what the normal version of OS2 2.1 cost. In spite of IBM's lamentable tendency to repeatedly shoot themselves in the foot and then look confused, OS2 somehow actually continued to grow in popularity, and its user base was steadily increasing. This was definitely more due to its growing reputation for stability and ease of use, and the good word of mouth generated by contented users, and the increasingly fervent OS2 fanbase, than it was from IBM's continued incompetent marketing department. The growing concerns about Microsoft's behavior and business practices didn't hurt either, with IBM increasingly benefiting from its reputation as stodgy and out of touch, rather than pure evil incarnate. However, in October of 1994, OS2 3.0 was released to the public. It would be followed by an updated version, OS2 Warp with WinOS2, scheduled for release in early 1995. Same as the prior version of OS2, the versions were differentiated by their support for Windows 3.1, with the original Warp release, OS2 Red, lacking built-in support for Windows 3.1 applications due to not including Windows, and the later release, OS2 Blue, coming with the full version of 3.1 pre-installed. These names are not official names, but came about because of the two different spine colors on the OS2 retail boxes. This might come off a little confusing, so let me clarify. Either version of OS2 could run Windows, but OS2 Red didn't include it, so the user needed to have it already installed on their system, and then install OS2 on top of it. OS2 Blue came with a complete copy of Windows 3.1 built into it, and thus could be installed directly without needing anything else in order to run Windows 3 era applications. This was undoubtedly done for the same reason as OS2 2.1 had done it, to reduce the amount of royalties that IBM had to pay to Microsoft in order to license Windows. Of course, it did rely on the sales rep being knowledgeable enough, or caring enough, to point the customer to the correct colored spine for their needs, instead of just selling them Windows. Either way it was done, OS2's Windows compatibility was extremely easy to use, as from the user's perspective, all that happened was a new window popped open that was running Windows 3.1, complete with Program Manager. Any 16-bit application that ran under Windows 3.1 would run just fine, provided the system resources were sufficient, of course. And this release came with a marketing failure so complete that it almost killed OS2 all on its own. And it all started with Star Trek, Paramount, IBM's chairman Lou Gerstner, and some remarkably incompetent performances from IBM's lawyers, who were apparently seeking to prove that marketing wasn't the only division of Big Blue that could royally screw things up. For years, OS/2 releases had been given internal names lifted from Star Trek, including Borg and Klingon. To be very clear, these names were merely internal code names, not names for the actual OS/2 releases. In keeping with this tradition, OS/2 3.0 had been given the internal code name of Warp. Unsurprisingly, this was in reference to warp speed, a fitting term for OS/2 3.0 as it was supposed to be noticeably faster than previous versions. As its release date neared, Chairman Gerstner decreed that Warp would be the official name of not just this release, but of the product as a whole, with OS/2 being henceforth known as OS/2 Warp, and this release being OS/2 Warp 3. The Star Trek connections with this name were cool, hip, trendy, and many other spiffy adjectives that IBM had never been remotely associated with, so it seemed like a smart marketing coup. IBM went ahead and based their entire marketing for OS/2 3.0 around a fairly obvious Star Trek-based theme, renting out a big hall in New York City for the announcement, sending out hundreds of invites to various movers and shakers in the computer world to come cover the announcement, and for a special treat, invited Patrick Stewart to come headline the event. It was going to be incredibly splashy, really giving OS/2 Warp a bold entrance into the marketplace and hopefully associating it in people's minds with the aforementioned cool adjectives. And with OS/2's maturing as a product, it was a fairly worthy target for such branding. OS/2 Warp was a very stable operating system. It maintained its excellent backwards compatibility with Windows 3 era applications, and of course it could run the vast catalog of MS-DOS applications that were still a significant part of the software market. It was also fully 32-bit, in an era when consumer Windows was still struggling to awkwardly straddle that gap. Windows NT is another topic, of course, something we will be dealing with in the future in a separate video. The OS/2 world was very hopeful about this release and IBM's plans for handling it and marketing it to the mainstream consumer. It seemed like IBM finally had an unqualified winner on its hands from both a feature and a marketing perspective. The OS/2 faithful were optimistic that this time Big Blue was going to do right by their favorite operating system, and the story of how it all went horribly wrong, and the faithful OS/2 supporters gathered in New York City didn't even get to see Patrick Stewart, is just painful. A quick word on OS/2 specific publications, by the way, as this will become relevant in a minute. Apart from IBM's own OS/2 developer magazine, there were apparently at least 3 major outside OS/2 publications: OS/2 Professional, OS/2 World, and the descriptively named OS/2 Magazine. Actually, there seem to have been 2 different publications named OS/2 Magazine, but one was apparently renamed to OS/2 and Windows Magazine just a few months after it launched in 1990, so I'm not counting it. All were independent of IBM, but as previously mentioned, at least the first 2 were formed thanks to the efforts of IBM's independent vendor league. From what I gathered, IBM ensured that at least the first 2 of these magazines had access to their registered user list, gaining an immediate audience of 70,000 recipients for the inaugural issue of OS/2 Professional in November of 1992, and presumably a similar one for OS/2 World. I don't know very much about OS/2 World, and I have not been able to find an archive of back issues, but OS/2 Professional is an excellent resource for tracking the ups and downs, wins and losses of OS/2 at any given time during the magazine's run. I have no idea if publisher and editor-in-chief Edwin Black ever heard this, so on the extremely off chance that he ever sees this video, let me just say that you and your staff at OS/2 Professional did a great job covering OS/2, warts and all, and your hard work was very helpful in creating this video. And Edwin Black is another individual that I will be periodically referencing, as he is a great example of someone outside of IBM who wanted OS/2 to succeed and was extremely passionate about it. His magazine, OS/2 Professional, is a great read and clearly shows the love and passion that motivated a lot of the OS/2 community. It also is a great way to see a number of examples of frustration that boiled to the surface periodically when the fans of OS/2 saw IBM, once again, failing to handle OS/2 correctly. IBM's Personal Systems Programming, or PSP division, contributed a letter to OS/2 Professional's inaugural issue saying, "On behalf of everyone at IBM Personal Systems Programming, congratulations on the debut of OS/2 Professional. We're pleased that your publication is dedicated to serving the needs of the rapidly expanding community of users of OS/2 2.0, IBM's advanced 32-bit operating system. While many in the industry talk about the operating system of the future, IBM has already shipped more than 1 million copies of OS2 2.0. In the coming months, we hope OS2 Professional will become an important source of news and information as we add new products and functionality to OS2, and users find new ways to increase their productivity. Thank you for joining us as we build the bridge between yesterday and tomorrow with OS2 2.0. Fine words if they are pretty much just bland corporate speak, but their source being IBM's PSP division is rather ironic in light of just how much damage this division was apparently going to do to OS2 in the coming years. Damage so great that OS2 Professional itself was going to be explicitly calling for this division to be closed down in a May 1995 publisher's memo from Edwin Black that was very bluntly called Dismantle PSP. But this was a couple years and some considerable bad blood away. OS2 Professional's editorial bent was, of course, very pro-OS2, as might be expected, but it took a very honest and straightforward position editorially, even though it obviously depended heavily on the revenue gained from the ads placed by IBM itself, especially at first. This meant that while the magazine would get excited about OS2 news and hype, it would also call out IBM for shortcomings, and especially its botched marketing. And let's just say that IBM's handling of criticism does not exactly show them in a good light. Articles that covered both the good and the bad of OS2 were apparently extremely negatively received by IBM, who seems to have wanted nothing but praise and adulation from extremely compliant publications. Or in other words, IBM wanted Nintendo Power, but instead got next-generation gaming. I mean, just watch the segment from a 1993 episode of the Computer Chronicles called What Happened to OS2? Where Black and OS2 Professional are introduced.
No, I think there was a war, and I think the war is over. It ended last fall during Comdex when Windows NT failed to show. Right now, OS2 has demonstrated that it has revolutionized personal computing. It is a system that is so revolutionary, it will actually give time back to its users, take the frenzy out of personal computing. And I'm speaking of the multitasking. I'm speaking of the fact that a simple individual can do 10 things at once, not through his own energies, but through the energies of the computer, which is why OS2 is known for harnessing the computer and not the operator.
Does this sound like a man who was anything other than passionate about OS2 and enthusiastic about its features? This is hardly the behavior of a man who wanted anything less than total victory for OS2. Yet, it seems that his willingness to call out IBM's many failures with OS2 didn't exactly endear himself to Big Blue. While I only have the magazine's word for it, the evidence seems fairly conclusive that IBM continually displayed a very thin skin in regards to any editorial criticism. In a June 1995 article called Caught Between Microsoft and IBM, Black wrote that the magazine's previous coverage of OS2's failures had provoked IBM's ire such that, in Black's words, "In the past, IBM has harassed me with telephone calls to my house at 1 a.m. to complain about articles, instructed its Canadian ad agencies to pull CSET advertising, and explicitly state it was in retaliation for articles, faxed our confidential business plans to competing magazine publishers, and threatened to pull our license to use OS2 in our name, unless we ran a photograph of a PSP marketing executive, and each time we have steadfastly refused to cave in." And having read a decent amount of OS2 Professional's Warp coverage in particular, I have to say that they come across very even-handedly. Clearly people who loved OS2 and were big fans of it, but also weren't blind to its issues and weren't afraid to call out IBM's poor decisions, especially in the area of marketing. IBM, flailing around on all sides against the consequences of its poor decisions, was apparently only willing to listen to unqualified praise of OS2, rather than tough love by the people who honestly seem to love OS2, hate Microsoft, and want OS2 to succeed with the very best product possible, backed by smart marketing. It's fairly easy to draw a straight line from this attitude to OS2's eventual fate. So, with all the aforementioned in mind, let's take a look at what OS2 Professional had to say about OS2 Warp 3. In the October 1994 edition, a publisher's memo to the reader called Warp Launches appeared before the issue's two main features on Warp, both of which were drawn from using Warp's final beta. This memo strikes a painfully optimistic note about IBM's OS2 Warp plans, stating, "IBM Worldwide is pulling out every marketing stop it has. Our monk is involved as never before. Lou Gerstner personally renamed the product OS2 Warp just days before launch. And this time, IBM is putting its money where its mouth is. TV, radio, billboards, direct mail, publications, retail programs, OEM efforts, and it's all happening simultaneously around the world. The publisher's memo went on to state that the research that went into the issue's coverage of OS2 Warp was the most fast-paced and frustrating assignment in my 26 years of journalism. It took 3 times as long as my investigation of the Kennedy assassination that helped reopen the Warren Commission, 3 times as long as an investigation of Senator Dave Durenberger that led to his indictment, twice as long as the opening article on the largest malpractice insurance fraud in the history of the U.S., resulting in numerous prosecutions, and it took 12 times longer than a similar story on Computer Associates and OS2 Professional last year. What normally takes 1 to 2 calls for any other story took 12 to 15 calls to nail down the details of OS2 Warp version 3. The 2 main features on Warp in this issue are grouped under the overall title of OS2 The Next Generation. The first feature covers OS2 from an installation and general use standpoint, and is so blatant about drawing connections to Star Trek that the article title is Working at Warp Speed, and there is an actual image of the Enterprise on page 1. As a matter of fact, the Enterprise is part of both features on Warp in the magazine, and Star Trek is an implicit part of every title. The other article, which covers the marketing plans for OS2 Warp, is called The Warp Campaign Phasers on Stun. This sort of, shall we say, Star Trek adjacent marketing was about to bite IBM rather painfully in their suit-clad hindquarters. That's getting ahead of the story. OS2 Warp 3 was shaping up feature-wise to be a great product, and one that IBM badly needed, but the review team at OS2 Professional was not going to just declare it perfect and go home. Errors in the install process are noted, including one that showed up when attempting to install OS2 Warp over a previous version of OS2 that required over half a dozen wipe and reload from backup steps before the correct solution was found. This solution required manually editing config.sys before doing the upgrade. Always a fun part of any operating system upgrade back in the day, or at least so I've heard. I was a Mac user in the 90s, so I didn't have to deal with these things. In fairness, the article points out that they were working off a beta release of Warp, and that these bugs had most likely been resolved before the final release. Jerry Pornell contributed an article as well, one that was less laudatory towards older versions of OS2. Basically, he took issue with how pre-warped versions of OS2 could put the user in a bind, where the Windows virtual machine locked up so badly as a result of a misbehaving application that the user couldn't get back to OS2 itself, forcing a whole reboot and a potential loss of work. To be fair, I'm not exactly sure of the relevance of this article, given that Warp fixed the major issues Pornell was writing about. However, I like the article's inclusion, as it shows that the magazine was doing its best to balance being a cheerleader for OS2 with being even-handed in its coverage of it. Plus, I am always entertained by Pornell's typical article formula of breaking something while trying to do something, and the detailed steps he was forced to take to resolve the problem. So far as OS2 Professional was concerned, the overall impression of OS2 Warp was very good, with their review pointing out, among other things, that OS2 Warp will now run reasonably well on a 4 MB system, with a realistic sweet spot of 8 MB or more, a decrease from 2.1's 8/16 MB target. You heard right. IBM's fancy new version of OS2 actually had lower system requirements than the previous version. This might be the first time this ever happened, and it certainly was a worthy achievement, one that Microsoft still hasn't managed to pull off. OS2 Warp was additionally lauded in the review for its vastly improved multitasking, making it far harder for a misbehaving application to lock up the entire computer and force a restart. However, Warp did have a rather serious issue with the GUI itself. According to an excellent article from Ars Technica on OS2, it was possible for a misbehaving OS2 application to lock up the entire OS2 GUI. To be clear, the computer was still running and background processes were still executing. You just couldn't, interact with anything. In the words of the article, unfortunately, OS2 had a crucial flaw in its design, a synchronous input queue. What this meant was that all messages to the GUI Windows server went through a single toll booth. If any OS2 native GUI app ever stopped servicing its window messages, the entire GUI would get stuck and the system froze. Okay, technically the operating system was still running. Background tasks continued to execute just fine. You just couldn't see them or interact with them or do anything because the entire GUI was hung. This was definitely a problem, although in fairness the computing world of the mid-1990s was far more tolerant of computers freezing and requiring restarts than we are today. Thanks to the cooperative multitasking of the classic macOS, I clearly remember needing to reboot the family Performa fairly frequently whenever Warcraft 2 or StarCraft decided to be naughty and freeze everything when switching between full screen and windowed mode. So Warp's issue with occasionally freezing wasn't as big a deal as it would be seen today, but it definitely was a negative. On the positive side, OS2 Warp was finally shipping with what was called a bonus pack in every box. This was an application suite that included a spreadsheet, a word processor, a flat file database, and a personal information manager. Most of these applications had been available before, but bundling them together and including them for free in every boxed copy of OS2 sold was an unusually smart move for Big Blue. And these applications were solid enough in their features for most users, with OS2 Professional saying the applications within the bonus pack are robust enough for most users and include such advanced features as mail merge, DDE links between data and the disparate applications, spell checking, and data import and export. Overall, the OS2 coverage in the magazine was thorough, fair, and about the farthest thing from a corporate snow job one could imagine. It did rely on a rather heavy dose of optimism about IBM's competence, and some equally optimistic assumptions about problems in the betas that would surely be cleared up before Warp went gold and the final preview copies went out. In fairness, I must note that IBM at least gave a fair impression of doing a lot right during the run-up to Warp's full release, and I don't see the magazine's optimism in any way as somebody closing their eyes, sticking their fingers in their ears, and hoping. Rather, it was optimism that seemed to at least be reasonably warranted. And I also didn't quote or cover any of this for humor at anyone's expense. Rather, I want to very clearly make the point that the OS2 community loved OS2 in a way that IBM, bland corporate master of staid business machines that filled entire rooms, never really understood and appreciated. There was genuine fervor and devotion to OS2, and OS2 Warp was generating a lot of well-deserved excitement and hype in the community. Warp seemed like a fit product to go to warp speed, and to the ranks of fervent OS2 supporters, the future, finally, seemed bright. Now let's return to IBM's planned exciting release of OS2 Warp and the event it was throwing in New York City to launch it and its Star Trek adjacent branding. All seemed good to go as the date for the event drew near, and the OS2 faithful got more and more excited. This was going to be a memorable night, maybe even as exciting as the iconic launch of the Macintosh a decade prior. Okay, definitely not that exciting, but still, the light coming off of OS2 Warp was almost blinding. And then a rather significant problem abruptly appeared on the horizon and suddenly slammed right into IBM. In all of the excitement, IBM had somehow neglected to reach out to Paramount, the owners of the Star Trek brand and franchise, and make sure that they were fine with IBM making such an explicit connection with the Star Trek brand, a connection that had already been widely embraced by the OS2 community, as is evidenced by the aforementioned OS2 Professional article. Paramount, who had already gotten annoyed at the casual way IBM had publicly used its internal Star Trek codenames for previous versions of OS2, decided to cut IBM off at the knees. Official legal notices were sent from Paramount's lawyers to their IBM counterparts, warning them that Warp was a trademark of Paramount and could not be used in any way that tapped into the Star Trek brand, whether implicitly or explicitly. IBM could use an alternate dictionary definition of Warp, but again, not in any way that infringed upon or suggested the Star Trek brand. This was a bit of a problem. Actually, a huge problem, especially from a marketing perspective. IBM had already put a lot of time into establishing the name OS2 Warp in people's minds, and it was felt that it was too late to change to another name. Regretfully, nobody suggested reaching out to George Lucas to see if he could be persuaded to let IBM rename OS2 Warp to OS2 Hyperspace or OS2 Millennium Falcon. Sadly, instead of that, IBM's marketing department decided to reach for new heights of creativity and stick with the strict dictionary definitions of warp, such as bent, twisted, and warped. Oh, and adding insult to injury, Patrick Stewart did not appear at the Warp launch as originally planned. Instead, the OS2 faithful had to settle for Kate Mulgrew from the then upcoming Star Trek Voyager show. The desperate attempt to redo the entirety of OS2 Warp's branding and theme, while still keeping the same name, resulted in a psychedelic advertising campaign that, to an overly critical mind, may have been dreamed up from the center of a That 70s Show camera twirl. Advertising was created that encouraged the prospective user to warp their computers by upgrading to OS/2, channeling the spirit of Cheech and Chong for an operating system that already had an uphill battle was a unique way of selling to the mass market of the mid-1990s. As In Search of Stupidity puts it, everyone, of course, was thrilled at the prospect of running a psychedelic, warping OS that smoked dope and had flashbacks when you asked it to retrieve a file. And the full rollout of Warp was also further marred by the fact that on top of struggling to reposition OS/2 Warp's branding away from Star Trek at the last minute, IBM also had to deal with getting its new marketing agency, Ogilvy and Mather, up to speed. And why was this necessary? Because this agency had been brought in to replace IBM's previous marketing agency, Lintus, who had been fired in May of 1994. When fired, apparently one of the Lintus executives rather presciently stated they'll never be ready for the fall, meaning the October release date for Warp. So Ogilvy and Mather basically got dropped into the thick of things at the last minute and had to struggle to get the revised marketing for Warp sorted out and running. Unsurprisingly, the turmoil generated by trying to change up ad campaigns at the last minute, plus deal with the change of marketing agencies, plus IBM's own unique brand of bad luck and poor planning, well, it was just too much. As a matter of fact, it seems that IBM's advertising executives in the PSP division had no idea who their Ogilvy and Mather counterparts were until about a month before Warp's October release. This obviously made the already difficult challenge of marketing Warp even harder. It seems that literally everything that could go wrong from a marketing campaign did go wrong for poor Warp before it was even out the door. The result of all this hasty scrambling around was an ad campaign known as OS/2 Warped, and it was, as previously mentioned, every bit as confusing and poorly thought out as you would expect by this point. OS/2 Professional wound up doing a full article post-mortem on the marketing disaster, and they pulled absolutely zero punches, stating that the launch itself, which even this reporter hailed as a great event, was much ado about nothing in the wake of an advertising campaign that did not get it right, a marketing strategy that got it wrong, and a product that unfortunately made headlines for its boo-boos. I will add that it seems like the idea for going with the traditional meaning of warp apparently came from and was implemented by Ogilvy and Mather, so while IBM signed off on it and thus bears its fair share of blame, the failure was definitely a team effort. Although fairness also compels me to balance this out further by pointing out that the decision to stay with the Warp branding but use an alternative meaning definitely came from IBM, and thus Ogilvy and Mather were pretty limited in what they could do with their limited time to plan. As the OS/2 Professional Postmortem says, in a great paragraph that really encapsulates the entire problem with the whole Warped campaign, most significantly, O&M used the wrong Warp concept. Gerstner didn't want to reinvent the well-established Warp name used throughout the beta period. But that name, Warp, was taken from the Star Trek lexicon, evoking images of fantastic speed and physics-boggling abilities. O&M and PSP opted for the disordered, wobbly, can't-get-straight warp, the misshapen wood warp, the twangy guitar warp. The wacko, wobbly, off-key warp image O&M propagated did not have the same intrinsic power of the faster-than-light warp. Voila! The power of the warp name IBM invested so heavily in, the one Gerstner sought to capitalize on, was in fact lost, or worse, turned into a negative image business could not have confidence in. OS/2's baffling ads for getting warped were not exactly setting the faithful OS/2 fans on fire with enthusiasm. Quite the opposite, actually, as the publisher of OS/2 Professional, Edwin Black, wrote a steaming editorial for the magazine in which he expressed his extreme displeasure with an OS/2 ad he had seen while passing through O'Hare Airport. In this ad, legendary basketball coach Phil Jackson smiled dreamily at the thought of warping his computer. OS/2 Warp also had a series of ads that never actually showed OS/2 at all, rather it was just shots of people's faces reacting to OS/2 Warp's various features. The ad campaign was called It's a Warped World, and the ads ended with the painfully "Hello, fellow kids" phrase,
OS/2 Warp, a totally cool way to run your computer.
Still, OS/2 Warp somehow soldiered on, helped along not only by its reputation for stability, but also by Microsoft's increasingly bad reputation with the U.S. Department of Justice. More developers we're actually creating OS2 applications, not just rebranding their Windows ones via using the fig leaf of OS2's Windows compatibility. Retail sales of OS2 itself began to pick up strongly, and at the 1994 Technical Interchange Trade Show, an IBM-run event, a large number of software vendors had completely sold out of all of the OS2 applications they had brought as eager passersby snapped them up. The ability to fairly easily run the vast library of 16-bit Windows software inside of a true 32-bit system that also featured proper preemptive multitasking was a huge selling point for driving sales, if properly marketed. Although a caveat on this compatibility is the fact that running virtual machines on the slow consumer hardware of the mid-1990s may or may not have provided a good experience on demanding Windows applications. I remember trying out soft Windows 98 on our family iMac, and it wasn't exactly a speed demon, although of course Windows was far better integrated into OS2 than soft Windows was on macOS Classic. Some possible good news for Warp was the fact that Windows 95's beta had shipped with a nasty bug that caused it to freeze when attempting to run multiple 32-bit applications, something that Warp seemed to handle quite well. This bug was called out from the front page of InfoWorld in their March 27, 1995 edition with the cover title reading, "Operating System Freezes Running 32-Bit Multitasking Apps," and a money quote inside that said, "What was publicized as the largest beta program in history failed to turn up a fundamental architectural flaw in Windows 95 that causes the operating system to freeze when multitasking a 32-bit application." This could have been turned into excellent marketing for Warp as well, helping it to build as much market share as possible before Windows 95's actual release, and finally giving IBM the firm foothold in the operating systems market that they had been groping their way towards for years. There was certainly no way to stop the oncoming juggernaut, but favorable press around a good product given months of unchallenged time to build sales, well, it goes without saying that this was probably the best opportunity IBM had been given since the mid-1980s. Some parallels may be drawn with Sega's attempt to build as big a market share as possible for the Dreamcast before the PS2 launched. And if you know how that attempt wound up working out, well, nobody watching this is doing it from their Dreamcast 3, in between rounds of Modern Warfare, Panzer Dragoon 4. In May of 1995, a mildly updated version of OS2 Warp aimed at the enterprise market was released called OS2 Warp Connect. A New York Times article from that same month stated that this version was designed to make it easy for thousands of computers to share not just hardware such as printers, but also various applications and information, saying, "The intention is to provide a single product that lets customers share printers, software applications, and information with a variety of computers and operating systems without having to spend hours learning how to interact with each one." That same article goes on to say that OS2 had sold 9 million total copies of OS2 in total, 2 million of which were copies of Warp that had been sold since its introduction in fall of 1994. That same article does unfavorably contrast this number with the 60 million copies of Windows that had officially sold, which of course does not include the rampant piracy of early versions of Windows that Microsoft, ever aware of the advantages of market domination, was happy to turn somewhat of a blind eye towards. OS2 was still in no danger of supplanting Windows at this point, not with its existing market share plus the imminent release of the juggernaut of Windows 95 just around the corner, but IBM was still, somehow, settling into a decent, if distant, second place, as opposed to Apple's rapidly dwindling market share at this point. Warp was on the verge of taking OS2 to sustainable success, and in spite of IBM's best efforts, things seemed to be breaking its way very favorably. It would take a serious act of incompetence to throw this away, something genuinely, monumentally stupid. As usual, IBM was up to the challenge. But first, let's set the stage a bit with another monumental piece of poor decision-making by Big Blue, who you might remember also had a personal computer division. A personal computer division that, even though it wasn't the largest PC maker anymore, still was a major player in the PC market. You would think that IBM would have started pre-installing OS2 on every IBM PC that went out the metaphorical door just as soon as it was possible. You would be wrong, as IBM's hardware and software divisions apparently enjoyed treating each other like bitter enemies. According to an excellent 2002 article called Who Killed OS2, which you can read over at os2world.com, the IBM PC company and the IBM Personal Software Products division had this in common. They both sent their profits to Armonk, and if there were no profits, the firings were decreed in Armonk. There was no love lost between them. Each looked upon the other as the enemy. PSP believing that the PC company was trying to run them out of business by failing to preload their software, and the PC company believing that PSP was trying to put them out of business by trying to force OS2 on them when their customers wanted Windows. It was noticed that IBM apparently didn't think enough of OS2 to put it on its own machines. A person wanting OS2 on, for instance, an Aptiva would literally have to beg and demand and threaten. Then, when it all did arrive, it often as not wasn't properly installed and wouldn't run well. Later, IBM would install both OS2 and Windows on some of its machines, but made no particular effort to persuade the user to boot one over the other, and many customers were unaware that they had OS2 at all. And of course, since IBM wasn't making any effort internally to include OS2 as the default operating system on its own computers, it sure wasn't putting in any effort to get OEMs to include OS2 instead of Windows as their default. Microsoft's cutthroat willingness to do whatever it took to get an OEM to sign a Windows licensing deal versus IBM's, at best, lackadaisical attitude toward the same, ensured that Microsoft pretty much had the field to itself when it came to what operating system OEMs bundled with their PCs. Sure, there were other companies, such as Digital Research, who were attempting to get OEMs to bundle their product, but these were pretty small companies compared to the Microsoft behemoth, and Microsoft over the years had had little trouble squashing such attempts. By the time of OS2 Warp, Microsoft essentially owned the OEM pre-installed market and would have very little trouble or competition keeping it, although obviously BOS gave it its best shot. Clearly, IBM was its own best enemy, and had been for pretty much all of OS2's life, but the years of self-sabotage were about to come to a sudden and concussive end, and it was going to start from the very top, very publicly. On July 31st, 1995, IBM CEO Lou Gerstner gave a speech during his yearly meeting with financial analysts, where he not only said that OS2 was waging the last war, implying that the current war was already lost, but he followed this up by saying that IBM had lost its opportunity to go after the desktop. It required very little spin for the news media to report this, as IBM admitting that OS2 had failed in the marketplace. The New York Times even ran an article on August 1st under the headline, IBM chief concedes OS2 has lost desktop war. The fallout of this, unsurprisingly, was sudden and drastic. OS2 vendors began to publicly express doubts about the continued viability of developing OS2 applications. A number of corporate installations of OS2 were canceled, and major OS2 columnists such as Will Zachman publicly announced their doubts about the platform. Will Zachman was a pretty big deal in the OS2 world, as he ran the largest OS2 forum on CompuServe, Canopus. So this would be roughly equivalent to, I don't know, Cult of Mac or Apple Insider declaring that they had serious doubts about Apple and were considering alternatives. Just 5 days after the first New York Times article detonated, a second article was run in their technology column section. This article was called OS2 No Longer at Home, and it had lots of shocking quotes from IBM's key OS2 evangelist, David Barnes, who we met earlier. Some of the key quotes from the article were, OS2 is a great operating system, Sony's Betamax was a better system than VHS, and the real killer quote, I'm going to put Windows 95 on the machines in my house. Reading through the article is pretty devastating to OS2. Essentially, the author, Peter Lewis, had been struggling to get the latest version of Warp to install on his new Pentium tower. After several days without success, Lewis called for help and David Barnes was sent over to help him out with his installation. I am assuming this occurred due to the potential bad PR that would occur if the New York Times published an article stating that it was very difficult to install Warp. According to the article, after spending more than an hour trying unsuccessfully to install OS2 on my machine, the normally effervescent Mr. Barnes finally gave up. He remains the world's biggest fan of OS2 as a reliable operating system for big businesses, but would he recommend OS2 to a friend who did not have a technical support team on call in the office? Let me put it this way, Mr. Barnes said. I'm going to put Windows 95 on the machines in my house. And as previously mentioned, David Barnes was a big deal in the OS2 community, having spent years traveling around to preach the virtues of OS2. This was bad enough, but then it got even worse as IBM's incredible ability to shoot itself in the foot yet again manifested. First of all, IBM did absolutely zilch for several weeks after Barnes' comments were made public. Not one single word, even as OS2 forums were blowing up with outrage and tech writers attempted to reach out to IBM for comments to no avail. The OS2 exodus picked up more steam as wavering users and businesses who had had their confidence shaken by Gerstner's comments decided that they had heard enough. Eventually, IBM realized that its strategy of playing some twisted version of Dead Possum wasn't going to cut it, and so Big Blue decided to eventually have Barnes release a mild PR statement that his comments had somehow been taken out of context, and IBM spokescreatures pinky promised that OS2 was still a priority for them. Unsurprisingly, nobody cared at this point, and OS2's demise was well and truly over and done with. I will say that OS2 Professional valiantly tried to apply some duct tape to the gaping hole that had been blown in the OS2 ship, with a publisher's memo from Editor-in-Chief Edwin Black in the October 1995 issue saying, "Was it decent or professional of Peter Lewis of the New York Times to invite David Barnes to his home for some personal help, guy to guy, and then publish the offhand remarks that any professional journalist should know would be off the record? Shame on you, Peter. Your article was disgraceful and uncalled for." And IBM, being a cripple, refused to answer back. I'm not here to comment on the ethics of what happened one way or another, but I would imagine that it would be hard for a reporter to avoid the temptation to report on something like one of OS2's biggest supporters admitting that he was probably going to be running Windows 95 in his house when it came out. Now, I do think that it's very likely that there was at worst some hyperbole or spin going on here, and at best some nuance was lost when a private conversation went public. I honestly cannot say for sure, and I am purely running on conjecture here. It's highly possible that what Barnes actually meant was that Windows 95 was good enough that he was going to use it for certain things in his house that he couldn't do with OS2. After all, OS2 Warp was not Windows 95 compatible, it could only run Windows 3.0 and 3.1 applications, and Windows 95 was certainly going to have a lot of applications that wouldn't be available on OS2 and couldn't be run through compatibility mode. When Betamax and VHS were battling it out, there were certain movies that were only on VHS, and it wouldn't have been unreasonable for Sony employees to quietly have a VCR at home in order to watch these movies. You wouldn't want to broadcast that if you were Sony, but it would be perfectly understandable, even if Betamax didn't wind up eventually losing that battle. But IBM's lack of response gave rumor plenty of time to take flight and for the whole OS2 community to get well on the way to melting down. By the time this whole situation started to, for lack of a better phrase, calm down, Windows 95 had already landed. Thanks to IBM's botched handling of the issue, the only competitor it faced was the then imploding Apple. Oh, and BOS, of course. Side note, BOS's open source successor Haiku-OS is a neat project that I hope continues to grow, and I am proud to say that I was one of the people who bought the alpha version on DVD like 10 years ago in order to help support the project. Back in the imploding OS2 world of October 1995, OS2 Professional did its best to take an optimistic view of things and the future, saying in its publisher's note that OS2 is alive and well. On the day Win95 shipped, OS2 Express had its best day of the year. Every day thereafter, we enjoyed record-setting days as our corporate and governmental customers made major, multiple purchases. IBM products and OS2 apps are selling better than ever. As I said last month, OS2 will only become stronger following the backlash against Win95, which is already happening. The bottom line for all who care about OS2, including me, is don't get angry, get even, stick with OS2. Again, OS2 had a very devoted user base, one that I would say could match the Amiga user base for devotion, and one that did its best to be positive about OS2's future, no matter how hard it got. You've got to respect that, and once again, the thought of such devotion accruing to an IBM product never ceases to be amazing. But it just wasn't going to be enough. So far as the broader consumer market was concerned, IBM itself had basically told them to never even consider OS2. And so far as developers were concerned, IBM had also told them to never bother considering developing OS2 applications. And thus, Windows 95 continued to sell in staggering numbers, finally definitively dethroning MS-DOS and starting to actually make a significant dent in the gaming market thanks to the first iteration of DirectX and the hard work of Alex St. John and his team. Yet still, somehow, OS2 miraculously continued to stagger on, with its user base resting on a core of die-hard users, plus a number of institutions that had invested significantly in OS2 installs or relied on OS2 specific software. There was also one more major OS2 release to come, plus IBM also had some rather odd stuff in the OS2 pipeline that the high points of which we will briefly summarize. In December of 1995, a rather experimental version of OS2 Warp was released for PowerPC, descriptively called OS2 Warp PowerPC. Although this was right around the time that Apple was transitioning from the 68K architecture over to PowerPC, this version of OS2 was not meant to run on Apple computers. Rather, it was aimed at a rather small line of IBM's own line of Power Series desktops and ThinkPads. OS2 PowerPC appears to lie somewhere between beta software and an actual finished product, with some areas quite mature and stable, and other areas completely lacking. According to this website, it had almost no networking abilities at all, meaning no TCP/IP and no local networking, although it seemed to have included a way of accessing CompuServe via modem. A bit more detail on the reasons behind the missing network support comes from IBMFiles.com's article, where it explains OS2 Warp PowerPC does not have networking, which has been a larger problem with the operating system. This is in part due to OS2 x86's initial design around the 286 and reliance of 16-bit drivers that are hard-coded to the x86 instruction set. Porting them wouldn't have been an easy task, and it looks like they ignored them for exactly that reason. However, OS2 Warp PowerPC did have a solid DOS emulator, as well as support for x86 applications, included as part of its apparently somewhat shaky WinOS2 compatibility. For more, I highly recommend checking out this article. I'll put a link to it on the screen. One more thing of interest. Some of the technology developed for OS2 PowerPC had a significant amount of development in it, and even after this edition failed, IBM apparently backported some of it to the main version of OS2 Warp. I recommend reading this other article I'm linking to for more information on this. In September of 1996, the last major version of OS2 was released into the rapidly shrinking OS2 market. Probably due to Paramount's reaction to the Star Trek internal codenames for previous OS2 versions and the whole mess around that, this version of OS2 was developed under the codename Merlin, but still retained the Warp consumer branding. When it was released, OS2 Warp 4 was, arguably, the best all-around operating system to see wide release in the 1990s for consumer PCs. And obviously, I expect my comment section to light up for saying this, but look at what the competition was. By this point, the Macintosh was a niche product, Copeland was about to go down in flames, and the clone program was about to mostly cannibalize Macintosh market share instead of taking share away from Windows. And speaking of Windows, it was still on Windows 95, and when Windows 98 came out, it still wouldn't match Warp 4's features and stability. Next Step OS was still available, but few people were buying it, and it was hardly in wide release. BOS was obviously a very solid, stable operating system, but it never got very far off the ground, few applications were written for it, and few people outside of techies had ever heard about it. Linux in the 1990s may have been getting a lot of buzz in the tech world, but it was only in the tech world, and its legendary user unfriendliness was in full bloom at this time. And I say this as someone who up until recently had been running PopOS for the past several years and doing all of the video editing and graphics creation for this channel on it. That all changed when I got tired of playing what will break this time when doing system updates, but that's a different story. The point being that Slackware and Red Hat were hardly in danger of threatening Microsoft's hegemony in the 1990s. Also, I feel like I should mention that the team over at System76 have built a great distro in PopOS, and had I been running it on one of their Thelio systems instead of my custom-built tower, I'm sure I wouldn't have had the issues that recently forced me to grudgingly move my video editing rig back to Windows for now. The only operating system that could have given Microsoft a run for its money by running on the computers that the vast majority of computer users owned, and was backed by a company with deep enough pockets to go toe-to-toe with Microsoft, and was a solid, stable operating system that also ran quite a few Windows programs seamlessly and had excellent DOS compatibility, was OS2 Warp 4. For all that, I still think that including Windows compatibility was always a mistake. Warp 4 was an excellent release that fixed, among other things, the synchronous input queue bug that had been one of Warp 3's more noticeable problem spots, as we previously mentioned. Rather than the mildly confusing red and blue versions of Warp 3, Warp 4 instead had Windows 3.1 compatibility apparently built into every version, although I assume that this meant that IBM was back to paying Microsoft for every copy sold. Warp 4 could also be installed over pretty much every previous OS2 release, apart from OS2 Warp Server 4, OS2 for SMP, and weirdly enough, Windows NT. I find it very odd that IBM's official guide to Warp 4, called Up and Running OS2 Warp version 4, felt the need to specify on page 17 that Warp 4 couldn't be installed over NT. Was this a thing that people were trying to do? Early versions of NT could run OS2 1X applications, as according to a Byte article from January of 1994, that was one of 5 application modes that NT made available to its users. This was undoubtedly a holdover from when NT was originally being developed as OS2 version 3. Given the confusion that people tended to have with the whole better DOS than DOS and a better Windows than Windows tagline, maybe the 3 confused NT users who had been running the limited number of OS2 1X applications had for some reason assumed they were actually running OS2 instead of NT, and had thus attempted to upgrade from NT to Warp 3 and been upset that it didn't work. Warp 4 also added voice input, although I am mildly skeptical of how well it worked, given my own experiences with voice input using Apple's Plain Talk technology back on the classic Mac OS when I was a kid. It was the sort of thing that was cool to show off, but had very little practical application for daily use. However, IBM's software announcement of Warp 4, titled IBM OS2 Warp 4, The Easiest Way to a Connected World, proudly boasted that you could navigate the internet or your desktop with your voice, dictate responses to email, and create speech macros to simplify repetitive tasks. If anyone watching this had any experience with using this feature in OS2, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. But the war was already over, and OS2 Warp 4 didn't have a chance of digging its way out of the giant hole IBM had buried it in. Of course, IBM was still IBM, and thus had to add an additional layer of incompetence on top of OS2 Warp 4's already impossible odds. Specifically in pricing, where IBM once again apparently forgot that they were not the market leader, but were in fact attempting to successfully regain market share from Windows, tempt MS-DOS holdouts to make the switch, and solidify their position as a strong runner-up in the modern operating system wars. And so, they apparently decided to price OS2 Warp 4 at $249 for the full version, or $149 for an upgrade from a previous version. Now, this was significantly better pricing than early versions of OS2 had enjoyed, but it was still higher than Windows 95's launch price of $209.95, and of course previous versions of Windows were much cheaper on top of being easily pirated. Not to mention all of the OEMs who got dirt cheap pricing on including Windows with their various PC compatibles. What IBM should have done is significantly undercut Windows pricing, push dirt cheap bundle deals to OEMs hard, and go on an aggressive all-out marketing campaign to show that OS2 Warp was back and better than ever. But that sort of clever positioning was anathema to IBM, and thus OS2 launched with more handicaps than were, strictly speaking, necessary. I mean, at this point it's basically just beating a dead horse. Plus, of course, its greatest handicap, which was the fact that IBM had basically told everybody not to consider buying it as it had no future. Unsurprisingly, OS2 Warp 4 had no momentum, no buzz, and no success. IBM had finally succeeded in putting a stake through OS2's heart once and for all. I will say, though, that while it's hard to know exactly what OS2's market share was at any given time in the 1990s, an interesting data point can be gleaned from the testimony IBM's head of network computing and software services, John Soiring, gave in 1998. We have met him before when he introduced OS2 2.1 on the Computer Chronicles. Here he was the 6th witness that the federal government called in their ongoing antitrust lawsuit against Microsoft. According to Soiring's testimony, OS2 had roughly a 6% market share at the time. By way of comparison, on January 6, 1998, CNN had an article that said, Apple's market share in the United States slips to 4.0% in the first quarter, before recovering slightly to 4.4% by the third quarter. In other words, even several years after the total implosion of OS2, it still had about half again as many users as the flailing Macintosh did. The final OS2 release was in November 2001, with a fairly minor release called the OS2 Convenience Pack 2, also known as the Merlin Convenience Package, which was built off of OS2 4.52. OS2 was dead and gone. The OS2 specific magazines and publications were long since defunct by this point, the remaining user base was rapidly shrinking, very little software development was going on apart from things like internal software development at companies that were still relying on internally developed OS2 applications. OS2 was a product stuck in the past, a relic of an era before wireless internet was ubiquitous, back when CompuServe was still a separate thing from the World Wide Web. Windows had leaped ahead to Windows XP, switching to the NT codebase and continued world domination. OS2's support for Windows was of course still limited to Windows 3.1 and 16-bit applications. It was a fading operating system that was less and less relevant as the world moved into the era of smartphones and high-speed internet. As legendary PC columnist John Dvorak, himself an OS2 user, said regarding OS2's downfall, Microsoft created a lot of interest, a lot of pre-publicity. They did a great job of promoting the Windows product before it came out, and IBM was very casual about it, thinking that people were going to flock to them, the guys who built the better mousetrap. It was just poorly handled. IBM had gotten a lot of breaks earlier, before Presentation Manager. You read a lot of stuff about how important OS2 was going to be, and then they just never followed up on it. There's a huge difference between the way the products were promoted and rolled out. I have nothing but sympathy for OS2 users, being one myself, but on the other hand, come on, it was so obvious that this was never going to go anywhere. And yet, somehow, OS2 Warp is still available for purchase today. Not from IBM, but rather from a third-party company that licensed the rights to OS2 and took over development in 2015. You heard correctly, OS2 is still being actively developed by a company called ArcaOS. This version of OS2 goes under the name of ArcaOS and is currently sitting at version 5, with an upcoming version, 5.1, codenamed Blue Lion, expected this year. ArcaOS is based off of the final commercial release of OS2 Warp 4. As previously mentioned, this was released back in November of 2001. And ArcaOS has benefited from some significant enhancements and improvements, with support for symmetrical multiprocessing, new drivers for modern machines, updated networking support, additional bug fixes, and even an updated kernel. ArcaOS is not free. Rather, it costs $129 for personal use or $229 for a commercial license. It is aimed at users and businesses who still need or want to run OS2 applications, and also allows for the running of 16-bit Windows or DOS applications. And this isn't the only company that's been involved with OS2 since IBM abandoned it. Back in 2001, two companies, Serenity Systems and Mensis BV, jointly started developing and selling a new version of OS2 Warp 4 called eComStation. There were issues with funding, the rights wound up held by a sister company now called Pay Global Technologies BV, and there hasn't been a new release of eComStation in well over a decade. It is, however, still allegedly available for purchase from ecomstation.com, although the website is, bare bones. In closing, I think there is no better summary of OS2 than the one from the final issue of OS2 Professional in February of 1996. This issue was a lot slimmer than previous ones, coming in at only 50 pages in total, when previous editions had sometimes reached 100. The rapid collapse of OS2 had indeed engulfed it in a shockingly short amount of time, just 6 months after everything fell apart and before Warp 4 had even launched. By this point, it was very clear to even the most ardent optimist that OS2 was done for, dead, but not yet buried. In Edwin Black's final publisher's memo, titled Right Now, he said the following: "We will be remembered as pioneers who had the vision and the guts to put ourselves on the line in the face of insurmountable stupidity by IBM and insurmountable cunning by Microsoft. Yes, someday all corporate Microsoft users will have what we have today, a superior OS, drag and drop, crash-resistant connectivity, speed, resource-lean multi-threaded multitasking, and backwards compatibility. Yes, someday all of Microsoft's Soho and personal users will have these same benefits changing their lives and the way they connect to the world from a single, powerful workstation. But we in the OS2 community had it first in 1992 and 1993, not at the turn of the next century." The memo goes on to give a great summary of the OS2 user base, the fans who had so fervently supported an operating system that could have been a serious player, but was repeatedly undercut and inadvertently sabotaged by its own creator, IBM. No matter how Big Blue fumbled and stumbled, no matter what the setback, no matter what the missed opportunity, you, the OS2 loyalists, would not relinquish the prospect that another horizon would clear beyond the clouds. Please take a moment after reading this column to congratulate yourself for standing up for an ideal and forcing the rest of the world to do it right, if only by your example. It was you who wandered through the desert of marketing incompetence, broken promises, false prophecies, and profound adversity to lead the way. I don't really think I can add much more to this. OS2 was a remarkable product that deserved a lot better than it got, and somehow saw a lot more success than one would expect from a product so relentlessly self-sabotaged. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing.